Thank you for having me. So, in the 10,000 years plus since we've domesticated dogs and cats, they've populated the entire globe. That's a map of dogs and cats in the entire world. Orange is cats, blue is dogs. You can see that cats tend to predominate a little bit. But look at this. That's the United States. Dogs are definitely winning out over cats, although New York State is a cat state. In the United States, we manage that population through an animal shelter system, and that system has performed a vital service for humans for decades. If you've ever traveled in a country without an established and extensive shelter system, you know what happens to unmanaged companion animal populations. Feral dogs and cats are everywhere. But in the United States, because shelters have existed since the 1800s, there are now very few feral dogs out there. And while there are many feral cats, they're not invasive in public spaces the way they are in other parts of the world. I don't know if you've ever traveled to Greece or around the Mediterranean and you're sitting in a cafe and a cat sort of jumps on the table and steals whatever you're eating. That tends not to happen so much here. Shelters are, in fact, so common in the United States that we take it for granted that if we can't keep a pet anymore, we always know there's an SPCA or a humane society to bring it to. And that's why every year shelters take in around 6.3 million animals. At Dutchess County SPCA, we average about 1,800 animals a year. New York City's Animal Care Center takes in 25,000 animals a year. My point is that the United States has a lot of unowned cats and dogs, but instead of roaming the streets, a large proportion of these are in animal shelters. And that leads to the critical and ongoing question that all shelters face, which is what to do with these animals. Adopt them out, yes, but that's not a cure-all solution for most shelters. We're lucky at Dutchess County SPCA because we have a strong adopting public here, and we're able to adopt out 97% of the animals that come in. But New York City's Animal Care Center takes in far more animals than it can adopt out. And some southern shelters have as many as 400 dogs on any given day. Where are they going to find that many adopters? They can't. So the traditional solution has been to euthanize animals for reasons of space or in the belief that death is better than spending a lifetime in a shelter. But in just the past few years, animal sheltering has reached a crossroads, due in part to changing attitudes toward animals and to a new progressive sense accelerated by, of all things, COVID. Shelters are rethinking their role as repositories for unwanted animals and instead inventing new ways to deal with our companion animal population. This new approach is based not so much on the animal's story as on the humans. After all, dogs and cats are not evolutionary products of a natural environment. They're here because they evolved in a human-made environment. We created them. We bred them to look and behave the way they do. Their destiny is inextricable from our own. A more practical way of saying that is that we must acknowledge that whatever brings an animal into a shelter is a result of human activity. You have to move, you can't take your pet. Your cat unexpectedly has kittens. You find yourself in financial straits and can't afford to keep your dog. What happens to these animals is a direct result of what happens to you. The American shelter system is only now realizing that it cannot deal with our animal population in a positive way, that is, without killing, unless it addresses the human factor. This really came into focus when COVID disrupted all of our lives. It's not just that everyone wanted pets while they were working at home. It's that a sea change occurred in how people see their lives now, and that really spurred animal shelters to reassess how they're dealing with people as well as animals. But before I get into what's happened in the past few years, I want to first take you on a short historical journey that will provide a context for these progressive ideas. Not many people are aware of how shelters in our country came into existence in the first place, and it offers a fascinating perspective on an institution that we're so used to having around. We sometimes don't even wonder how they got here or why they do the things they do. Now, I warn you that some of this is a little dark because the history of animals in our country is fraught with prejudice and violence as much as the history of humans. So up until around 1800, free-roaming dogs and cats were everywhere and little attention was paid to them until a disease called rabies appeared. When that happened, a mass hysteria about loose dogs followed, even though what data we have suggests that rabies from dogs was actually not as common as the media of the time suggested. Nevertheless, it made people suddenly take note of how many loose dogs were running around, and the public demanded something be done about it. For the first time, American cities and towns enacted dog ordinances. Dog licensing was instituted, not just to help identify which dogs were owned, but also to discourage dog ownership by making the fees deliberately high. Another step to control the dog population, cats really fell under the radar at this time, as they still do sometimes today, was that cities and law enforcement turned to an old European solution with authorized bounty hunting for dogs. People would receive a few dollars for every dead dog they brought to the police. Needless to say, that resulted in a sort of cottage industry of stealing dogs, whether they were owned or not, and killing them for money. And all that destruction, as is always the case, actually did little to impact the number of roaming dogs. Over the next several years, cities tried to regulate the bounty industry. Rather than letting private citizens get bounty for dogs, cities began to employ professional dog catchers. But the rules were the same, dollars for dead dogs. The dog catchers patrolled the streets, and if they saw a loose dog, they would not even check to see if it belonged to somebody, but would kill it and then bring the body in for pay. That, not surprisingly, caused considerable public outcry. But then in the mid-1800s, somebody got a better idea. Instead of killing the dogs out where everyone can see, let's pick up the dogs and take them to something we'll call a pound. That way, the public wouldn't see what was being done. Dogs didn't stay in the pound for more than 2 days. If they weren't claimed, then this happened. Those are dogs being drowned in crates lowered into the Hudson River. But why, you may ask, did somebody bother to draw this terrible scene in the first place? This image is from a newspaper trying to convey to the public what the pounds were doing, and that suggests that there was a degree of public outrage at these practices. Laws also had to be passed because dog catchers were regularly assaulted and their wagons broken into to let the dogs escape. Now, in my view, it's no coincidence that this public outrage happened just then. This is the industrial age. America and Europe were dealing with unprecedented social challenges that industrialization brought: urban poverty, new illnesses from polluting fossil fuels, violent crime. But with these problems grew charitable organizations and societies to address them. Civic problems inspired civic duty. It was part of the times that just when Western civilization was beginning to ravage the planet whole scale, a counter feeling of love for nature and the value of life, both human and animal, also developed. This was the age of railroads, urbanization, and mass production. It is also the age of Thoreau and Audubon and Darwin. Just as mass agriculture and production were beginning to commodify the natural world, people began to consider the possibility that animals were part of the same vast design to which humans belonged, and as such they could suffer and feel pain. And it also helped that in 1885, Louis Pasteur very thoughtfully developed a rabies vaccine, which mitigated the idea that dogs were a threat to the public. In response to this growing concern for animals, many states enacted the first anti-cruelty laws. These laws covered all animals, but were mostly about horses, which were the main beast of burden for commerce at the time. The laws were a huge step, but then as now, they were seen by many to fall woefully short of what was needed to be done for animals that were suffering on a whole new scale in the industrial age, especially in urban environments. And that's when this man stepped in. That's Henry Bergh. Taking as his model the first humane organization ever founded, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in England, which was recognized by the Queen in 1840, Bergh founded in 1866 in New York City the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA. For his efforts, Bergh endured a lot of ridicule. These are two newspaper cartoons about Bergh. The one on the left is particularly interesting in its suggestion that he had feelings for animals, but not for humans. In fact, Bergh was all about the humans, at least the bad ones. The ASPCA and other SPCAs that were established in the following years were not initially animal shelters. Instead, they were organizations that enforced anti-cruelty laws devoted to investigating and prosecuting cases of animal abuse, especially for horses. They did not take in animals. They were only interested in catching people in acts of cruelty. What did Berg feel should be done with all the homeless cats and dogs? He was in favor of destroying them, but by humane means. A little more on what was meant by humane means later. The point is that in its earliest iteration, the ASPCA offered no solution to what to actually do with the animals. That came from another person. This woman, Caroline Earl White, founded the Pennsylvania SPCA. She did not serve on its board because it was forbidden for women to serve on boards at that time. That also happened at Dutchess County SPCA, as well as many other SPCAs across the country. They were founded by women who had to hand over control to men once the organization was established, and then they participated through women's auxiliary committees. What makes Caroline Earl White so special was that once she established the Pennsylvania SPCA, she persuaded the men to let her open a second institution under the Penn SPCA auspices. And that second institution, in every sense, ran independently. That institution she designated as a shelter, the first in the United States, established in 1871, which coincidentally was also the year Dutchess County SPCA was founded. At this shelter, she said, people could take dogs and cats they had found or no longer wanted, and the women's branch would find new homes for them. An earth-shattering idea, not only for what it proposed, but also because it was a private institution. White fundraised for the operation. These were private individuals stepping up for the animals. And it began happening all over the country as an alternative to city pounds. At the women's branch, the dogs were cared for and efforts were made to find homes for them. But it wasn't a bed of roses for White or for the animals. White was sued, criticized in the press, excoriated publicly for her actions. Politicians who supported the city dog pound especially hated her. And the law made it very difficult for her. The women's branch shelter had to kill the majority of dogs it took in under the law. Dogs that were found in the street without a muzzle and all babies had to be destroyed. But White tried to do it as humanely as possible in those days, which meant drowning or carbon monoxide. To give you a sense of how the shelter operated, in 1880, White reported they took in 3,000 animals. 600 were reclaimed by owners, 100 were rehomed, 2,300 were killed. Still, White was ahead of her time in sensing that there was a different way to manage the animal population. From this time on, it became a struggle between organized humane groups that ran shelters and slow-moving government and legislatures, as it still is today in many respects. By 1894, 6 years after Henry Berg's death, the city of New York asked the ASPCA to take over the city pound, and the ASPCA became a shelter. Many other cities did so as well, and SPCAs became the alternative to city dog pounds, as well as the main arm of enforcement for humane law. Each of these SPCAs, most of which were founded by women, were independent operations. They're not part of the ASPCA as many think. That's still true today. They're not branches. They're not franchises. They're called SPCAs because they are based on the SPCA model of sheltering. Decades of struggle followed. The majority of animals at SPCAs, humane societies, and other shelters had to be killed because there simply were not enough resources to house them. In 1934, the ASPCA destroyed 99% of the animals it took in. They did this as humanely as possible, but until euthanasia by injection was developed, that meant drowning, suffocating, or giving the animals to medical schools. All shelters were in the same predicament. But before we condemn these early shelters, let's take a look at what it was like. ASPCA alone was taking in hundreds of thousands of animals every year. Other shelters, especially those that had contracts with cities, were equally overwhelmed. And we're not talking about pristine living conditions. Remember, this was before flea control and cat litter were even invented, so you can imagine. Many shelters had huge open pens that housed all the animals together, which meant infection was rampant. It was so bad that the argument could be made, and was made, that the animals that were stuck there were better off dead. In the second half of the 20th century, conditions improved somewhat with better kennel designs, but the trend was still to put animals out of their misery rather than let them languish in the shelter. Many shelters had policies in which some animals were euthanized immediately, such as all female animals. In order to understand the magnitude of the animal overpopulation crisis, you have to remember that it was the culture in America to have free-roaming cats and dogs, so they were everywhere. And this was true well into the 1970s and 80s. This is an article from the Bronx, 1974. I remember clearly as a child seeing dogs and cats walking around my neighborhood everywhere. I remember the detours I had to take walking home from school to avoid Mr. Shoddy's mean dog. In 1971, it was estimated that 15% of the animal population in Baltimore, the entire dog population in Baltimore, was killed in shelters. Nearly every cat that entered a shelter was killed. Not surprisingly, the way shelters worked fueled the idea that roaming dogs and cats were better off outside the shelter, so little was done to controlling the population. And there was a feeling of anger and suspicion about shelters and shelter workers. We still run across residual mistrust today. But then the game changed. Something extraordinary happened. And it was this. In the 1970s, a new surgical technique was developed that enabled spaying and neutering to be done in just a few minutes. Before this, shelters could not neuter animals, which is why the females were often killed on intake. But after veterinarians learned this procedure, shelters could perform safe, high-volume sterilization on their animal populations, and that changed everything. That and a new law that prohibited discrimination against women entering veterinary school. It was not just shelter vets that made the difference. Now that it was possible for pet owners to get their own pets sterilized safely and inexpensively, the population crisis slowly abated in the following decades. The establishment of low-cost spay-neuter clinics helped in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, private vets began to make it a regular part of their practice to offer spay-neuter. It was only when this happened that the phrase no-kill could conceivably be applied to a shelter. But that phrase no-kill, the result of a huge movement in animal welfare in the last 30 years, once spay-neuter impacted the population, means something very specific. It doesn't mean that no animal is killed. It means that a shelter maintains a benchmark of a live release rate of at least 90%. Dutchess County SPCA is a no-kill shelter because its live release rate, that is, the percentage of animals that leave the shelter alive, is 97%. What happens to the remaining animals? They are humanely euthanized, either due to medical conditions that compromises their quality of life, or because they have behavioral issues that make them a danger to the public, or sometimes they may die in care, and with us, that's usually neonatal kittens with compromising health conditions. There is no such thing as a responsible shelter that doesn't have to euthanize sometimes, though a responsible shelter will do all it can to avoid that, and no-kill shelters never euthanize for space. Because of spay, neuter, and no-kill, today in most parts of the United States, animal sheltering is a very different story than what it was even a decade ago. There are still shelters that struggle, particularly in the South, where spay-neuter is still in the process of becoming the norm. But in general, the number of animals entering the shelter system has dropped nationwide, and with it, euthanasia rates. There are now accepted standards for animal housing and nutrition. Most shelters have relationships with veterinarians or even have veterinarians as staff members, as Dutchess County SPCA does. Most shelters today are places where an animal can live comfortably until they're adopted, and people who adopt can be assured that an animal possesses a level of health that will allow it to have an excellent quality of life. That doesn't mean every animal is perfect. We do adopt out pets with medical conditions that can be managed by the average pet owner. And you would be amazed, or maybe not, at how many big-hearted people there are out there that will take an animal with heartworm, or a skin condition, or one eye, or 3 legs. But no-kill only really works if both ends of the process are accounted for. That is, we must deal not only with the outcomes for animals in the shelter, but with why the animals are entering in the first place. The entire history of animal shelters has been around trying to find humane ways to deal with the unowned animal population. It's been all about what happens to a dog or cat once it's already astray or surrendered. But what about the beginning of that journey? Sheltering is only now coming to grips with what's causing animals to be brought to shelters. And that's where the community comes in. This is the next big sea change in sheltering. Progressive shelters are no longer considering themselves as warehouses to store unwanted animals. Instead, they're seeing themselves as facilitators between humans and animals. They're realizing that in order to deal with the 6 million animals that are entering shelters each year, they must focus on the 6 million reasons why those animals entered and see if those reasons can be addressed before the animal arrives at the shelter. Progressive shelters must and are beginning to see themselves as human service organizations, and as such, they're working with the community so that the community will understand that these animals belong to all of us and are our collective responsibility. So let's look at some of the reasons why animals enter the shelter and see what we can do, all of us, to address these. First, strays. Why does an animal become stray? These are mostly dogs and cats that were allowed to roam free and were brought in by a good Samaritan or an animal control officer. If they're chipped, we can contact the owner. Most chipped animals get reclaimed immediately. If we locate the owner and the animal stays a while, it's usually because the dog is not licensed and they have to wait for fees to be paid, not to us, but to the town in which they reside, and that can be a burden. In the meantime, the town is paying us every day for the dog stays there. There are several ways to mitigate the problem of stray animals that have owners, and this is the most important of them. Microchipping. Microchips are tiny implants the size of a grain of rice that cause no pain to the animal and allow to be identified immediately. Second, don't let your pet roam without supervision. Even if they don't get picked up by someone, it's not safe out there. Nearly all injured animals we get in are hit by cars, attacked by other animals, or they've eaten something toxic. Also, your pet is at great risk of being stolen. And we are not always talking about being stolen by someone who's going to bring them home with them. Those are the lucky ones. We're talking about being stolen by dog fighters who use cats and small dogs for target practice, or people who sell your pet to anyone for $20. Additionally, let's end dog licensing. It doesn't work because there's no way to attach the license to the dog beyond a tag that can be easily removed, which makes it easy to steal dogs. Many people don't even bother to license their dog because of fees and bureaucracy. Instead, replace licensing with a microchip mandate. You pay a fee to the town once and get your chip upon proof of rabies vaccinations. The case for microchipping as opposed to licensing is that there's a clear incentive for the owner to have the animal identified with them if it's lost and to not pay renewal fees. For towns, they don't get the renewal fees, but they don't have to pay us housing costs, since it's very easy to return an animal in the field. This is what the city of Dallas has done among other cities, and it's been very successful in cutting the number of stray or unidentifiable animals. The other main source of animal intake at shelters are owners who want to surrender their pet. In the past, it was always assumed the owner no longer wanted the animal, and it was a shelter's moral imperative to take it. But that assumption is incorrect. When you talk to most owners, they more often than not would keep their pet, but for some reason or other. Shelters are now beginning to ask what that but is and to offer help. The moral imperative now is not to take in as many animals as possible, but to keep as many as possible united with their owners. Most cases of surrender fall into a few categories. For instance, the animal is sick and the owner can't afford vet care. Shelters like ours now offer emergency medical repayment programs. If your pet has a condition that can be treated by us, we'll treat it at cost and customize a repayment program to make it affordable enough for you to retain your pet. We've done this for hundreds of animals in the past 2 years. There's also a credit card called Care Credit, which works for both animals and people. It has no interest for medical expenses. We found in our program that even the most financially strapped owners will keep their pets if we assist them in these ways. No animal should have to be given up because it's sick. So now many shelters are offering services to prevent that. Another reason for surrender, something catastrophic has happened and the owner can't take care of the animal. Someone has to move, or they're in the hospital, or have suffered some other disaster. Many shelters like ours now have safety net boarding programs in which we'll board the pet for 1 month free of charge. We've had a program like this for a long time with Grace Smith House and expanded it during COVID. By taking a pet in temporarily until someone gets back on their feet, we've been able to divert over 400 animals from being surrendered in the past 2 years. It's expensive, but it also means those are over 400 animals we don't have to house even longer than that while they were waiting to be adopted. And those are 400 animals who could eventually resume their lives with the families that loved them. Third reason, the pet has some sort of behavioral issue, so the owner turns it in. The most common behavioral reason for people to turn in cats and dogs. Anybody know what that is? What the most common reason is, especially for cats? No. Right. They don't use the litter box. Or the dog's not housebroken. That's something that can be fixed. Other issues like barking, fear of strangers, guarding of food or toys are manageable issues. They may not be cured, but the home environment can be modified in ways that will avoid triggers for these behaviors. At Dutchess County SPCA, we have field teams that will go to a person's home and assess and advise on how to manage behavioral issues. We've been able to help many people who are at their wits' end keep their pets and develop better relationships with them. We can't solve every issue, but we can at least give it our best shot to try to keep a pet with its family. If we can't help, we have partners who may be able to help. My point is, if your pet's behaving badly, your first impulse should not be to get rid of it, but to use the significant resources that are available to today's pet owners to try to manage the issue. Fourth reason, the owner has died or gone into assisted living. Please make a plan for your pet in case something happens to you. It is heartbreaking for us to receive a 10-year-old dog or an 18-year-old cat that's lived in one home its entire life. They're in shock at finding themselves taken away from everything and everyone they've known. Talk to a friend or family member now about taking your pet if you're not able to care for them. And also, I know this is controversial, but if you're in your late 70s, think about what it means to adopt a young animal. A kitten can be a 20-year commitment. I so hope that at age 90 or 92, you're still here and in wonderful shape to take care of your cat. But if not, you're going to repay that animal for its love for you by eventually abandoning it. At my age, I would never adopt another baby animal, but I would definitely get an older cat or dog. Older pets are the best and easiest companions. They're already house trained. They won't climb your curtains. They won't eat your trash. They're plug and play companions. And you're doing an extra special good deed by getting an older pet out of the shelter. Just yesterday, we adopted out a senior dog to an 88-year-old woman. And you never saw a happier pair ever. These are some of the things that you can consider if you're a pet owner to help your pets and help keep animals out of the shelter. Remember, shelters will work best and do best by animals if we can control the number of animals entering them in the first place. That's precisely why Dutchess County SPCA has devoted so much of its resources to our community programs to help pet owners before they have to surrender. And I'm happy to say that this shelter is part of a nationwide trend in that regard. It's our goal collectively through progressive programs that help pet owners to reduce the number of animals entering the shelter by half. That's what the double dog dare is, because we have double the dogs here that could actually be in the shelter if these programs were instituted nationwide. We've already demonstrated that we can even reduce the time a pet stays in the shelter by as much as 50% with these programs. There are other things the community can also do. Support trap neuter return programs. TNR, as it's called, traps feral cats, of which there are an estimated 96,000 in Dutchess County alone, neuters and vaccinates them, and returns them to where they can be found. These are cats that are born in the wild and can't live with people. Their life expectancy is only a couple of years, but in those 2 years, they can have as many as 30 kittens. If you have feral cats on your property, arrange to trap them or have them trapped, and then when they're returned and can't produce more offspring, take care of them. It's free rodent control. We'll be happy to help you in managing feral cats so that they can at least live out their short lives in relative comfort and security. If you absolutely must give up your pet, take advantage of our home-to-home program, in which we can link you up with someone looking for a pet who has also been screened by us. If you're looking for a pet, let us know and you can join the home-to-home database. Finally, one of the most important ways you can help your local shelter is by fostering a pet. Fostering is the single most critical aspect of the new model I've been talking about. Not only is it great for the animal, but it leaves us space and resources to help the injured and behavioral animals. If you have a lifestyle that doesn't allow for the commitment necessary to keep a pet forever, fostering is a great option. It's like being an aunt or grandparent instead of a parent. You get all the fun without the long-term responsibility. And think what it means to an animal to live its term as a shelter animal in a home instead of at the shelter. Fostering is the best expression of the community's involvement in animal welfare because it embodies the fundamental principle of the new shelter model, in which the community becomes the shelter and the animal welfare organization, the SPCA, becomes the human resource center to help our community as a whole take care of its animals. Thank you.